Hi, everyone. Welcome back. And thank you for joining us today. My name is Tom Timmins. I lead the Energy Sector Industry Group here at Gowling WLG, and I'm absolutely delighted to welcome everyone back to our final Energy Innovator Roundtable of 2021. It's been quite a year. I think we're well positioned here to take on one of the most important topics in the world, obviously the topic of COP26 here at our final roundtable of the year. Just to give you a little bit of background, we've been doing the Energy Innovator Roundtables now for a number of years here at Gowling WLG. They historically took place around a table, usually where breakfast was served, and they were meant to be an opportunity for a relatively small group to have an open and forthright conversation and a sharing of ideas. Of course, since COVID-19, the Energy Innovator Roundtables have evolved. We now have a much larger group, but we are doing our best to replicate the closer, smaller feel of the original roundtables. As such, I'm delighted to welcome our panelists, but I do want to invite everyone in the audience to please feel free to ask questions. And given the level of expertise that we have today, ask your toughest questions if you can, because we have some of the best and the brightest with us here today. This roundtable will be recorded and it'll be available on our website shortly after after it concludes, probably sometime tomorrow or Monday. So as I mentioned today, we're going to be talking about COP26. You'd have to have been living under a rock if you don't know what that is, or if you missed it. COP26, of course, took place between November 1st and November 13th in Glasgow under the leadership of the United Kingdom. While Canada was at the table and did make a number of commitments at COP26, the exact outcomes from COP26, and in particular the impact on Ontario businesses, remains to be seen. As most of you know, we usually invite outside guests to join us at our Energy Innovator Roundtables. Today is a little different because the complexity of the greenhouse gas regulation and the potential impacts of COP26 invite a really deep dive into highly complex issues. To put it succinctly, we will be going into the weeds today, and I'm hoping that that's helpful to a lot of you. With us today to help us sort out the impact of COP26 for Ontario are three of my favorite colleagues, all of whom are uniquely qualified to help enlighten us on this fraught and complex topic. Ben Stansfield, as you can see, joins us from the UK, where it's evening. Ben is one of the UK's leading lawyers on planning and environmental permitting matters. Jennifer King, recognized as one of Canada's leading lawyers in energy and environmental law, called to the bar both in Ontario and in Nunavut. Jennifer has been deeply involved in the recent Supreme Court of Canada case involving the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act and its constitutional and impact for Canada, as well as in the development of the Henvey Inlet Pattern Wind Project, which many of you in the renewable space will be quite familiar with. And last but not least, my partner, Adam Chamberlain. Adam is the leader of our Climate Change and Environmental Law Group. Adam is certified as a specialist in both environmental law and in Indigenous legal issues. He's also recognized by Chambers, Lexpert, and a number of other ranking agencies as being among Canada's leading practitioners in this field. Besides that, he's a genuinely nice guy. Adam, Ben, Jennifer, welcome. I'm going to pass it over to you, Adam, to lead us off.
Thanks very much, Tom, except for the cheesy part of my introduction there. That was great. Thank you very much. Look, these are interesting times and interesting issues that we'll get to in a second. The first thing I just wanted to do before I hand off to my colleague Ben over in London is just mention a little bit. Many of you who are watching may have heard or know of Gowling WLG and our environmental practice, or for that matter, other elements of our practice, but you may know of us more as a Canadian entity. But Gowling WLG is not just a Canadian entity. We have a Canadian environmental practice that is frankly second to none and involves lawyers across the country at our various offices. But we also have, frankly, one of the best global environmental practices that spans the globe. And I don't know that the sun really ever sets on Gowling WLG, as the saying goes. But without getting into details, I mean, we have offices in the UK where Ben is, but also in Europe and into Asia as well. So I won't get into listing them all, but we need to understand these issues from a global point of view in order to be able to provide advice to our clients wherever they are. And sometimes that means focusing on local conditions, and we will talk about Ontario today. But it also means understanding what the regimes are in other jurisdictions. And in the context of COP26 and climate change and greenhouse gas issues, it means understanding these things on a global basis. So that because this is certainly nobody I think will argue that this is a global issue, it is, but it has different implications for different parts of the world and different countries and different clients and different sectors of the economy and that sort of thing. So I just wanted to make sure that everybody sort of gets a little bit of an idea of where we're coming from on this issue and why we're as interested as we are in it. So without further ado, I think I'll hand it over to Ben to talk a little bit about the UK, and then Jen can talk a little bit about the Canadian perspective, and I'll follow up with some discussions about some implications for Ontario. But this isn't meant to be a PowerPoint kind of presentation. This is meant to be a discussion. And so to the degree that we hope that we will provide that discussion, but at the same time, if you have questions or comments, please make sure to use the Zoom functions to convey them to us so that we can try and address them. Anyway, so I think I'll take this opportunity to stop speaking and to hand off to you, Ben.
Okay, good. Well, I'm going to say good evening because that's what it is here. And believe me, Tom, no one is more disappointed we can't get together than me, because having spent a year and a half or 2 years not traveling, I would have absolutely loved to have come to Toronto, one of my favorite cities. So greetings from London. But I thought before we sort of get into the detail of what sort of COP was about, the good, the bad, the ugly, and what the UK and the EU are doing about it, I thought it would be kind of helpful to sort of set the scene, because climate lawyers and environmentalists talk a lot about global sort of average temperature rises, and we talk about in the UK it was the phrase was keeping 1.5 alive. So we talk a lot about 2 degrees average temperature increases 1.5, and this is all by 2100, so about 80 years time. And that feels like a long way away. 80 years is kind of the next generation's problem, or the generation after that. And is there a big difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees? And it's easy to forget that there is a huge difference. And I thought I'd just sort of illustrate that if you'll allow me. So if global temperatures, the average global temperature increases by 1.5 degrees, we'll cope. It won't be much fun though. It won't be nice, but we will survive. You're looking at coral reef declining by 70%. You're looking at really extreme heat days. They're going to be 3 degrees higher. Sea levels are going to rise by between 25 centimeters and 75 centimeters. Doesn't sound like a lot, but when you think that 60% of the global population lives within 100 kilometers of the coast, that's huge. Insects, plants, vertebrates, they're all going to lose their climatically determined range. That's going to affect agriculture enormously, particularly as we move to plant-based diets. The Arctic Sea, that's going to melt. Sorry, the ice in the Arctic Sea will be ice-free once every 100 years. And there's going to be greater poverty. Food production is going to be dramatically impacted. Mass migration. It's going to be pretty grim, but we'll cope. Now, if you get to 2 degrees, it's a whole different kettle of fish. Coral reefs will decline by 99 to 100%. They'll just go. Extreme hot days, they will increase by 4 degrees, not just 3, but 4. Sea levels, you're looking at 40 centimeters to 90 centimeters. Terrifyingly, the Arctic Sea will be ice-free once every 10 years. And you can barely begin to imagine what impact that's going to have for wildlife in the Arctic. And again, please don't think that 2100 is miles away. My kids are 16, 13, and 5. They will be 95. Well, I can't really do the maths, but they'll be about 95 and 85 at the turn of the century. Their lifespans will be their access to medical care, to good clean air will be great. But as as elderly boys, men and women, sorry, boys and girls, men and women at the turn of the century, how will they cope in 2100? Is going to be pretty horrible. So we've put together a couple of slides and graphs which might help illustrate some of our points. I wonder, Jenny, if you could get our first one.
Ben, as I put that up, I also wanted to add, as you talk about the impacts, what we hear in Canada all the time is that Canada's currently experiencing some of these impacts that you've already mentioned. This isn't something that we're waiting for. We're experiencing it now. We can see the flooding in BC, and then, what BC also faced earlier this year with the heat experience this summer and the deaths associated with it. And what we're seeing from the IPCC and other international consensus of scientists is that this is also a global health crisis, a public health crisis. And in Canada in particular, we're facing warming at 2 times the global rate. In the Arctic, it's 3 times. And so these impacts are here, and we're dealing with them now.
Yeah, it's easy to forget that stuff, right? Because these are big set piece conferences, and it's hard to sort of lose the human reality of it, I think. So the emissions pathway graph that we've put up on screen there, you can see that sort of dark line going from the middle left, increasing quite rapidly, and that's that's the global emissions level. Now, we're currently at 1.1 degrees by all accounts, and the Glasgow Pact, which was the formal document signed at the end of COP26, the parties expressed their alarm and utmost concern, which sounds quite a sort of a British way of saying this is horrifying, but actually in sort of international legal terms, that's pretty strong stuff. And you can see that green corridor going through sort of from the middle, and it's like a kid's slide. It's so steep. We need to be within that corridor if we are to get to limit global temperatures to 1.5 degrees. And so we need to get to net zero by mid-century. That's the whole point of keeping 1.5 alive. So yeah, we're currently at 1.1, and I think we're on course for something like 2.7. I could barely find the research to tell us just how grim 2.7 is. I mean, it just doesn't bear thinking about. And the NDCs, these nationally determined contributions, which is, I guess, it's like sort of each country around the world, it's almost the bid, how they're going to sort of contribute to that 1.52 degree limit. I think the NDCs are taking us to something like 2.4 degrees. Again, just ridiculously high. This slide was prepared not by me, but just post COP, and I think the COP26 pledges should get us to just over 2.1, something like that. With a fair wind and a bit of luck, we might get to 1.8. But there is, I mean, we talk a little bit about how we all feel about COP26 and whether it's a success or not. But I think John Kerry talks about Paris built the arena, Glasgow wasn't the race, it just fired the gun, and there is a lot of work to do. So yeah, I guess from my perspective, it'd be interesting sort of Jen and Adam what you think, but I tend to be sort of a glass half full kind of guy, and so I was sort of quite happy, I think, about COP. I mean, it would have been lovely, wouldn't it, to have come away and gone, yeah, 1.5, we're going to get it, but it I think the press in the UK was almost a bit downbeat. I think people expected miracles and were disappointed when they didn't get them over here.
Yeah, I just would chip in a little comment about expectations. I mean, I think in Canada, the press has been mixed about COP26. I think there's a fair level of skepticism about these large international meetings. I wonder, just wondering, whether the fact that it was being held in the UK might have colored or provided a little bit more added optimism or hopefulness by the UK press and or just everybody there. I think outside of the UK, probably, or at least in North America, there's been a little bit more skepticism perhaps going into it. That having been said, as somebody who spends a lot of time watching these things and paying attention to what comes out of them, I was quite hopeful. And initially, I will say I was quite disappointed that we didn't see more from the final communiques and the final pact coming out of it. But what is interesting, I think, is looking at it in not just in the whole, all the countries in the world acting together, and I think there's an acronym in there somewhere we could make up, but looking perhaps at the various different break groupings within the thing. And I've actually, if you read some of the press on COP26, whether it's The Economist, which is, I would commend it as a good source of information, but a lot of the press is focusing on some of the elements that are coming out of COP26 that are not things that have been supported by all the countries, but rather by multilateral groupings, a bit of a hodgepodge of different ones, because usually these groupings don't have support from all of the members. Some of the big emitters, notably China, US, India, aren't part of them. But it's worth noting some of them, and I will take a bit of the wind out of maybe Ben and Jen's comments. I'll just refer briefly to Mark Carney's work with the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, and just say this: Canada and UK share Mark Carney. I think it was Ben that said this to me the other day, but it's true. And we as Canadians know Mark Carney well, and the UK do, because he's run both of our central banks, which is kind of an interesting thing to be able to put on someone's resume. But it's a good example. This is a bunch of businesses trying to do things, and I won't get into them because I think the others would like to talk about them a bit. But interestingly, it's not, as I said, it's not all the countries in the world acting together. It's a bunch of businesses acting together. And this is just one example of what we see, I think, that's perhaps the way of the future with these COP things. It's not just what all the countries are doing together, but rather what groupings of businesses and non-national actors are doing together.
Adam, to pick up on what you're talking about, I think that there is a lot of work, and historically at past COPs, there's also been a lot of work happening outside. We have an articling student who's been there. She talks about all of the work that's going on around that kind of main table. I also think when we think about the impacts of climate change, we often focus on the things that Ben and I have already talked about. So what are the impacts of rising temperatures? But also what we're seeing more now, and I'm involved in climate litigation, we're seeing what are the impacts of reducing emissions. And that's not like a zero-sum game either. So particularly in Canada, we see that. And so when we look at the hard work that all the participants have done in 26, and whether or not they actually were successful or achieved all of the objectives, which Ben will be talking about, I think that we also have to keep in mind that there's consequences of reducing emissions. And it's not just consequences, it's also consequences on our Indigenous peoples in Canada. It's consequences on our prairie provinces in Canada. So that's something also that the different participants are thinking about.
Yeah. Should we talk about the sort of who the good and the bad folk are in terms of emissions? Because I think that's on our next graphic,
Sure.
isn't it? So shall I sort of talk about the one on the left, Jen, before you jump in on the cumulative? But the I mean, if you sort of almost Google climate data, you can see this stuff sort of cut and dice any which way. So we've got blocks today rather than graphs. But I mean, I guess it's fairly well known, isn't it? In who the big polluters are in the world, and this is on an aggregate basis. So if it were per capita, excuse me. Excuse me. Sorry, Jen, do you want to do the cumulative and I'll come back?
Yeah, sure. Sorry, Ben. So I think that Ben's going to talk about kind of the annual emissions. And what's important to remember is to see the sum of all legacy emissions. So this is not just about the snapshot. It's important to also look at who is responsible for the emissions overall in the atmosphere today. And so that's what the image on the right shows. It really shows that, into the 20th century, global emissions were dominated by Europe and the United States, is what you can see in this image. You can't really see all of the detailed writing, and we can provide you with the sources of these graphs at the end of the presentation. But what this really shows you is how much it's changed. So in 1900, more than 90% of emissions were produced in Europe and the US. And even by 1950, they accounted for more than 85% of emissions each year. But in recent decades, this has changed significantly. And we've seen a significant rise in emissions from the rest of the world, particularly across Asia and most notably China, which Ben can chat about.
Yeah, sorry about that. I don't know what happened there. Anyway, I'm back now. Yeah. So as I was saying, you can see who the big polluters are, right? And there's no surprise. It's the Chinas, the Indias, the US, and if you group the EU together, and actually I think this might even be a pre-Brexit graphic because it talks about the EU 28. I wish. So I mean, if it were a per capita basis, you'd be looking at Qatar, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates. I think Canada's pretty high up on a per capita basis. Possibly even higher than the US and Australia. So it's you can cut and shape this whichever way you want. And I guess if we sort of take the view that that China, Russia, Turkey are all big polluters, it kind of hurts even more to sort of realize they weren't there. Their leaders didn't turn up, and I know that the Chinese and the Russian both sent this sort of negotiation or sort of negotiators. There was a delegation there, but when the world really needed some leadership from those parts of the world, it was a, I think rightly so, quite a big headline. And I think, but sort of what struck me, and you can see, I think red is Asia, green North America, yellow Europe, and at the bottom, I think green is South America, this lime green. And it's kind of shocking. Well, not shocking, it's kind of because there are a lot of headlines at COP about Brazil and Brazil's role in climate change and what have you. But actually, on an emissions basis, South America is not really the problem here. I mean, I think we're going to talk about deforestation a little bit later, and obviously there's the issues there. But Africa, again, I think that's the blue box. Again, not the major problem here, despite South Africa's reliance on coal. And just for sort of completeness, in that bottom right box, that's international shipping and aviation, because I guess they can't really be ascribed to any of the continents when you're across the Atlantic. Should we again sort of move on to fuel types now, Jen? Just sort of help set the scene.
So this is actually come from the same source, and these graphs show you emission sources by fuel type. And you can see on the image on the right, you can see emissions by fuel type from the world. And because carbon dioxide emissions associated with energy and industrial production come from a range of fuel types, as you can see, and the contribution of these sources has changed significantly over time. And we can still see a large differences by region. So you can compare that with Canada, for example, which you can see on the right. So you can see a really different makeup in the sources of carbon dioxide emissions by fuel type in Canada compared to the rest of the world. And so in these charts, we see the absolute and relative contribution of CO2 emissions by source. And the different fuel sources are coal, gas, oil, flaring, and cement production. And the reason why I wanted to show this is because we will be talking about the coal commitments that were discussed at COP26. And perhaps, Ben, you can comment on the emission sources by fuel type in the UK, which looks a lot different than Canada.
Yeah, and if you get me in the pub after work, I can talk at length about my views on the British government. But actually, on the environment, we're kind of doing the right thing. And it's hard for me to give Boris kudos, but he's pretty green. So yeah. And again, one of the startling things about, I think, from a UK perspective of these graphs is because, we haven't had coal really significantly for quite some time. We have decarbonised power to a pretty substantial extent in the last 10 years. We've closed our coal-fired power stations and we put wind turbines out in the ocean. We put solar panels pretty much everywhere. So yeah, for example, in the power industry, we have been pretty dramatic in our decarbonisation. We have a little app which gives you real-time data, and we are, I think, just over 1/3 gas currently, just under 1/3 offshore wind, which is a bit of onshore but mainly offshore. Currently no solar, but if you'd asked, if we'd had this at my lunchtime, we'd have been at sort of 7-8%. Nuclear is generally around 12%, and then we've got some imports as well. So we have, and actually, the government has pledged. Interestingly, since we've got a lot of power clients on the line, we've pledged to be to fully decarbonize power by 2035. And we can very happy to talk about how we're going to do that, or how the government thinks we're going to do that. But the bulk of the UK emissions at the moment are from transport. And our homes. So we heat our homes using gas. So it's quite interesting. Someone asked me the other day, you know, how is what are the challenges for the climate in the UK? And actually, it's persuading the tabloids to get on board with this stuff, because it's going to be, you know, we've got to be put into electric cars. We're going to have to insulate our homes, and we're going to have to get rid of gas to heat it. And gas is super convenient, right? And there's all sorts of concerns around air source heat pumps and stuff. So, you know, if we can get the tabloids on board, then we've got a chance of doing this. But, you know, we've had protests in the UK, Insulate Britain, and sort of in the run up to COP, and people were literally gluing themselves to motorways to get their message across. And, you know, the press was horrendous. And instead of focusing on why they're doing it and what the positive messages were, they were focusing on, and understandably, you know, the ambulance that couldn't get through, or the kids that couldn't get to school. And I think that's the narrative, I guess, that needs to change in the UK. But yeah, I think we're up to about 48% cuts overall across the economy in the UK since 1990. So yeah, we don't really, you know, it's hard not to feel a little bit smug.
Well, just to give a little bit more of a comparison with Canada and UK, I just wanted to note that according to the Environment and Climate Change Canada's inventory, transport and oil and gas make up 50% of Canada's emissions profile, and have increased since 2005 by 15 to 20%. Electricity emissions, on the other hand, only make up 8.4% and have declined by 48% in the same period. So, you know, just you were mentioning about the focus of transportation in the UK, and we see the same thing here.
Yeah. Okay. Shall I talk a bit about the actual sort of COP26 goals? Because we've sort of spent sort of 20 minutes building up to this sort of crescendo of, you know, there's the problem, and so what did COP do about it? And there were 4 goals, and I think it was Adam, very, very generous, saying that the UK was the sort of host of COP26. I forgot, apparently Italy was the co-host. Slightly curious that you'd end up in Glasgow, but so I think Italy had a few sort of warm-up events in Milan, but I should, for full disclosure, give some credit to the Italians as well. But yeah, there are 4 goals which were set by the presidency. So it was net zero by 2050, and that's how we keep 1.5 alive. And we've got some little images there. And how do you deliver on the net zero target? Well, COP26 President Alok Sharma said you need to accelerate the phase out of coal. You need to curtail deforestation, which is a bit frustrating because there wasn't as much talk about reforestation and rewilding as the environmentalist in me wanted. But so we're going to stop deforestation. We're going to speed up the switch to electric vehicles, and again, I think the UK has been pretty sort of bold in that sense. Not quite Norway levels of bold, but you know, we've been doing a pretty good job on that, and encouraging investment in renewables, which kind of stands to reason. But the other goals were, yeah, adaptation to protect communities and natural habitats. So there's the environmental tick from me. And it's, you know, again, in the UK, we talk so much about decarbonisation. We talk about greenhouse gas emissions, and there's just no real focus on the natural world, which I think is quite interesting. You know, all being well, many of our countries will have decarbonised, got to net zero in 30 years' time. But so we'll have kind of done that. We'll have ticked that box, and then we'll be talking about how do we sort of restore the world. And I think that's a much longer play. So it's interesting. Quite a few of our clients in the UK are starting to talk not just about decarbonisation, but actually biodiversity and all this kind of stuff, which is probably another podcast. So yeah, we're going to protect and restore ecosystems, build defences, warning systems, all that kind of stuff. Green finance, that was, you know, a real major focus, and again, that's where Mark Carney was in his element and doing a fantastic job. You know, going green isn't cheap, right? The UN, I think in Paris, the various signatories had committed to raising $100 billion per year for developing countries to mitigate and adapt to climate change, and I think there's been pretty woeful performance, and actually the Glasgow Pact was, again, use sort of language of sort of expressing disappointment and what have you, which again was a very sort of stiff upper lip way of saying it's, you know, bloody outrageous that you guys haven't sort of raised the money yet. But there was very much a focus, I think, at COP about how the private sector was going to be helping and unlocking, the 100 billion from governments would unlock the trillions of pounds and dollars needed to address the climate emergency. And then it's a little bit cheesy, the whole sort of working together to deliver, but I think we've made it pretty clear that this is a global problem, and we have to collaborate. And that's a question of sort of government collaboration, businesses, like Adam, Jen, and me collaborating across the Atlantic, and civil society as well. I think that was one of the real themes, one of the sort of strong themes I got from COP was that this is a kind of a bottom-up thing. For example, in the UK, we declared net zero emergency, climate emergency and net zero in 2019. But we took 2 years to get our net zero strategy as to how we were going to do that. And in those 2 years, business just took over, just did its thing and said, right, okay, well, that's the direction of travel. Leave it to us. So I guess, I suppose from my perspective, did it achieve goal? Well, again, I think I've talked about sort of being a glass half full kind of guy. I think it did. I think, I suppose my big worry about COP is that it almost felt like we needed another week, didn't it? There was maybe Adam, you sort of talked about the UK was saturated with news. So I was living, breathing it, watching, live coverage at times that suited me rather than massive time zone problems. But it felt that there was a real a lot of protesting, a lot of sort of people power, and that drove a lot of business leaders, and certainly it drove Boris to go back to Glasgow. He started out, did his set piece, came back on a private jet, went for dinner with one of his mates in London club. It didn't go down very well in the media. Various other issues in terms of sleaze and what have you hit the headlines. So he thought, what do I do? I know, I'll go back to Glasgow. I'll start being a greenie again. And so I think a lot of that was sort of public pressure. And I think COP27 is going to be in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. And I remember when Sharm el-Sheikh was attacked, the terrorist attacks a few years ago, they managed to shut that down, that resort really carefully, very quickly. So are we going to get the same level of public participation in Egypt, forcing and reminding global leaders to do the right thing? And again, I think COP28 is going to be in the UAE. So again, are we going to get the same kind of people power?
Ben, and we're starting to get questions coming in, and we've had a couple of really good questions. One of our participants, Leo Fleming, made a point that our images on the COP26 goals need to be updated. The phase out of coal, of course, didn't happen. And instead, and this is similar to several of Canada's commitments, you have to read the wording of the outcomes very carefully. We're not going to phase out coal, according to COP26. We're going to phase down coal. And of course, everyone saw that in the media. But if you drill a little bit deeper, you'll see similar language changes have been made, including Canada's commitments not to stop direct public financing of coal, oil, and gas development, but to stop new public financing. There's a lot of carefully worded language there. So a great point from Leo there. Another question that came in, sorry to interrupt, but was, and Ben, you had kind of alluded to this, but the concept of electrifying everything. This is from Ravi Sathapathy. The concept of electrifying everything. Is that something, Adam, Jen, that you're starting to see in Ontario, or that you can see a future for Ontario?
Well, I'll take a run at this just quickly. I mean, it's a critical question of what is the source of electricity, because if you electrify everything and you're using your electricity is coming mainly from coal-derived power plants, then of course, the electrification is sort of meaningless because you're just moving the emission from the tailpipe of the car to some other place in farther away with big wires in between. So it really depends on where you are. And interestingly, Canada has a lot of green electricity, and Jen already mentioned this in terms of the percentages. So electricity isn't a huge one for Ontario. We already use a lot of hydroelectric. We use a lot of nuclear. Of course, we use an increasing amount of gas. So over time, we got to figure out how to move that, especially if there are implications for if carbon eventually does have a real price, whether it's nationally or internationally. But we're in a much different place than we would be, say, if we were in the prairies, where you've got more coal generation and more fossil fuels creating supporting our electrical grid. But in BC, Quebec, Ontario, big parts of the country where we've got very green electricity. But that is something to think about, because this assumption that putting electric cars on the road is going to solve the problem is a little illusory if you're putting them in places where the electricity grid is largely supported by coal generation. So, for instance, in China, places like that, and different jurisdictions in North America as well. So there's a couple of thoughts there. Jen, do you have something you want to add to that?
Well, I'll just add that, Canada signed a memorandum of understanding and a declaration related to working towards zero emission truck and bus sales and zero emissions cars and vans within the next several decades. And I'll just note here, given my interest in constitutional law, of course, that's a commitment that Canada signed. And how that's actually going to play out in Ontario, Tom, further to your question, it gets complicated. As we know from the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act reference, which we were involved in, our firm, it is trying to translate something like that, a federal international commitment to how Ontario is going to make choices, which is going to impact our province. It is going to require a lot of work. And I know Adam has already mentioned it, and the Supreme Court mentioned it in the GGPPA case. We need to have cooperation and collaboration at all levels of government, including within Canada. So how that's going to play out, we don't know yet. We haven't seen a plan yet, the specific plan from Canada, let alone how it's going to really work out in Ontario.
It's a really good point, and it's one that whenever I'm talking with my colleagues, not Ben, but other colleagues from the UK, there's often this a bit of a divide, because UK is a unitary state essentially with one government. Well, sort of other governments with increasing devolution, I suppose, happening. I won't go into that.
We'll strike that from the record.
But largely a more unitary, less provincial, less confederal system than Canada has. So a little different in terms of how you coordinate. We do constitutionally have issues with joint responsibility for the environment in Canada. It makes it more complicated. So that's something to mention. And I'm just going to pick up quickly, Tom. Ravi just clarified that the point that was being made there was more about source reliability. So I presume thoughts about you can't electrify your car or charge your car battery relying only on wind or solar if it's not windy or not sunny. And so that just does bring us to the point that you need not only to be considering what is the carbon output of your grid, but also how stable is it, how easily is it supported. And these are very interesting and important questions to consider, because you can't run electric vehicles just on wind power. But most grids have a mix, and our Canadian mixes are relatively green and yet still fairly, depending what you consider nuclear to be. When we'll see where things go as the initiatives continue to green the grids, if you will. Sorry about the consonants there. Anyways, I'll stop for a second. Ben, I think you were talking when we sort of digressed a little bit.
That's fine, and I think Leo made a really good point. And I'm going to defend myself here and say that phasing out coal was the goal. That's what the COP presidency talked about, and that's what the slide was intended to achieve. And yeah, that was the big headline over here as well, that it went from phase out to phase down coal. And Boris in his press release, in his final statement, was sort of saying, well, I don't understand any difference between phase out and phase down. But actually, it's quite interesting if you look at the sort of the Glasgow Pact. Maybe phase down is the right word. So they talk about calls upon the parties, accelerate development, yada yada yada, rapidly scaling up the deployment of clean power, while accelerating efforts to phase down unabated coal power. So if you look at the sort of preceding sentence when they talk about scaling up renewables, maybe phasing down is intended to be the opposite. I don't know. And then I'm a lawyer. I've been a lawyer for 20 years, and I've been sort of thinking, is there a difference between phasing out, phasing down? I don't know. But it's it's interesting. There's a lot of. I think the bigger issue is about unabated coal. I think for a while it was hope. Unabated has sort of slipped in, hasn't it? And there was a really interesting news night on BBC, and they had the Colombian energy minister. And he was saying, yeah, we don't really burn coal much over here, but it's a massive export for us. Without coal exports, we're really screwed. And actually, exporting coal, there's no carbon issue there. There's no carbon issue in mining it, putting it on a boat and sending it. It's the people who are burning it. Blame them. And if you abate it, if you capture the carbon, then it's fine. We should use it. And yeah, it's kind of hard, isn't it, to argue against some of these sort of developing countries who would have a real trade gap without it. So I don't really know how I feel about it. But just on coal, again, I think we've sort of both said that Ontario and the UK are coal free, and so again, quite hard to sort of. It's very easy to forget that it's a big thing. It's coal is something like 40% of global power production, isn't it? It's monstrous. We were talking earlier about this sort of these series of mini agreements, mini protocols, and what have you, which are sort of almost like sort of side events. And certainly one which got the biggest press, I think, in the UK was the sort of a transition statement around coal. And the various signatories said, yeah, we're going to scale up renewables. We're going to scale up tech, which I interpret as carbon capture and storage type sort of technology. We're going to cease giving out new permits for new unabated coal plant, and we're going to give support to workers and local communities. So we're sort of just. I think they talk about a just and inclusive transition. So they're supporting people out of one economy into another. But I think the really interesting issue on this sort of coal statement is who signed it, or rather who didn't. So I think that the press in the UK are like, over 100 countries signed this new coal statement. I think about a quarter of them have no coal, either no coal reserves or they don't generate power from coal. So well, why are they signing it? There's no win there. But the big folk who didn't sign, there's well, let's talk about the graph on the left. So you can see that these are some of the signatories to the coal plan, and you can see that Indonesia, Vietnam, South Korea, Canada, and the UK, they're all there. And I think Indonesia and Vietnam and South Korea are the top three. But if you look on the right, which are the sort of the countries which are reliant on coal, those three countries are pretty far down the list, right? I've put little arrows on them. Which might not appear so well on the webinar, but China didn't sign, India didn't sign, the US, Japan, and you think, well, how valuable really was that? Was that process? I mean, I don't know. I'm a bit frustrated by it, I think.
Well, and just to jump in, Canada did sign a commitment to end coal exports by 2030, so that's worth noting. And as I think it was Adam and Jennifer mentioned, coal's not at all important in Ontario at this stage in our electricity generating story. It has been historically. But the other piece is, to move on from coal, questions about methane. And I'm not sure who among you paid much attention to the impact of methane on climate change and any of Canada's commitments on methane. And methane, natural gas, of course, Ben, as you probably know, does constitute a big piece of the energy mix here in Ontario and across Canada. And it also is a major export for our country. It has a big impact actually on our balance of payments and our dollar. So I don't know if Jen or Adam, if you have any thoughts on how Canada's commitments on methane might impact local players.
Well, why don't I just say first, before I pass it to Adam, that on methane, during COP26, Canada re-upped its support for the global methane pledge. And this is something that the federal government initially offered their support to in October and vowed to cut methane emissions by 30% from levels recorded in 2020 by 2030. And this pledge now has 110 supporters. So and ECCC does say that methane accounts for 13% of the country's total greenhouse gas emissions. And what I will say before I pass it to Adam is to say, Canada still hasn't told us how they're going to meet those targets. And so kind of consistent with a lot, I mean, granted, COP26 just ended, but these commitments that Canada has made, many of them aren't new. They're kind of reiterating or re-emphasizing the commitments they were already making, including in their new climate plan from last year, from December of last year. And we still don't have a specific plan on how they're going to meet that target. And with that, I'll leave it over to Adam.
Yeah, I mean, I'll make a comment about the process. In Ontario, for instance, there's a regulatory requirement that if you run a large landfill, and by the way, landfills account for a significant amount of methane emissions, and methane is somewhere in the order of 24 times as bad as a greenhouse gas as carbon dioxide. So converting methane emissions into carbon dioxide, it still gives off greenhouse gases, but it reduces them quite dramatically. So in Ontario, there's a requirement that landfills collect their methane, the landfill gas created by all the stuff decomposing, and either flare it or somehow manage it. And we're seeing that has been in place from a regulatory point of view now for some time, actually. So arguably, any benefits that you see from that conversion of methane to carbon dioxide from landfills is already being accounted for by regulation, required by regulation. So there's it arguably shouldn't be part of a reduction that you see at a national or provincial level, for that matter. The interesting thing I think that's neat about methane management is we're starting to see it being used differently. So there is now an increased move to, I'm aware of many large projects in Ontario where you've got a landfill gas that will be moved from the landfill into a scrubber and then into the natural gas system. So it's not being just flared, which means that even though you still, again, combust that natural gas, that methane, the clean natural gas, or RNG as it's often called, renewable natural gas, it does get burned in my house to heat my house and many other houses. Its carbon footprint is being reduced. So you're starting to see that happen more and more. The challenge is going to be, where do we see those things accounted for? Will they be accounted for by federal commitments, or does that somehow fall into some other category? And those are interesting questions, and there are similar questions with respect to electricity and who gets the benefit or who gets the credit for, the emissions being reduced. And the contracts deal with that, and they're complicated questions. But I think it's going to be interesting to see how we manage those issues as between Canada and Ontario, and among the other provinces as well. So just a few thoughts there, Jen.
Yeah. Well, can I just, to pick up on something you said, and perhaps this is it's a bit too far afield, but you talk about how to account for the reductions. And one of the things that I've heard mentioned quite a bit, Canada is quite excited about, is I'm going to have to read this out, International Sustainability Standards Board. So Gowling WLG has a ESG group that Adam and I are both parts of in Canada. I think Sam is involved over in the UK in ESG work. And this is pretty exciting to me. So at COP26, it was announced the formation of this new International Sustainability Standards Board to develop comprehensive global baseline of high quality sustainability disclosure standards to meet investors' information needs. And it's been great that there's been a focus in the past several years, in particular, on ESG disclosure and reporting, but it's really resulted in a complicated web of standards and processes. And so the intention is to focus them now. And there's a lot of excitement in Canada that Montreal was selected as one of the host cities to host one of the central offices. We share that with Frankfurt. I think that from what I hear, Canada would have liked to have had that office, but we have one of them. And the ISSB has already released early frameworks and drafts demonstrating a change in direction. And I think that'll give everybody some more clarity and some more focus on how these standards are going to be across the globe. Because as we know, I'm sure everyone's heard a lot about carbon pricing, these are the kinds of things that have to be broadly adopted. And so having broad standards that aren't piecemeal will be useful.
Excellent. May we go back to Ben about, Ben, you were doing some thinking about methane, I thought, at one point.
That's very generous. If you thought my face was thinking about that, I probably don't have much to add on methane actually. That hasn't been said. I mean, we can talk about deforestation now if that's again it's sort of one of those really interesting sort of side agreements that came out of COP26. And actually what's it really positive about deforestation? We know we've shown you a load of graphs, you know, methane, what was the other one, coal, where sort of the global baddies who have been at the top of those graphs haven't signed the agreements. But actually, when it comes to deforestation, you can see, you know, Brazil has got a pretty substantial part to play. They did sign the agreement. So did the Democratic Republic of the Congo. I don't think Bolivia did, but Indonesia did. So you know, we've got 3 out of the top 4 who signed up to the deforestation principles, which is grand, I guess, until you look at what they signed up to, and it's all a bit woolly. I mean, I suppose a lot of these things are, aren't they? But I think the point around deforestation is that, you know, in the last 60 years, more than half of the world's tropical forests have been destroyed, mainly as a result of agriculture. You know, that's responsible for 80% of all deforestation. So there are all sorts of good stuff, you know, good principles, good comments made at COP26 about conserving forests, facilitating sustainable trade, reducing vulnerability, enhancing rural livelihoods. Again, it's this sort of one industry being phased out, phased down, and a new one putting in, sustainable agriculture being incentivized and what have you. And I, you know, again, sort of think about this in the power sector. We haven't, you know, biomass in the UK was a very exciting thing, I guess, about 10 years ago. It was they were getting a lot of you know, big biomass plants of sort of 300 megawatts were getting a lot of consent, often in poor and struggling, you know, areas, because there was a port which was sort of on the wane, and the idea was that they would be bringing over wood chip from South America. It's quite a sort of a heavy process in the sense of, you know, a lot of jobs compared to gas-fired or nuclear or something like that. So yeah, local authorities, local municipalities are really going crazy for this stuff, but none of the really big schemes ever took off because the sustainability was just so sensitive. And so biomass, I think, produces about sort of 5% of the power in the UK, but it's really difficult to see it sort of ever going beyond that. So again, I don't know if biomass is a big feature of Canadian life.
It has been relatively growing. I mean, I'd still say it's not, it features somewhat similar to the way you're describing it in the UK, Ben. But it has been part of feed-in tariff development in Ontario in particular. We've also seen it in other jurisdictions where other forms of carbon credits or offsets can be attached to the facility and then sold. So for instance, in Alberta, there's been some biogas largely related to either the food industry or feedlots, that sort of thing. So we do see it. It's an area that could be grown more. I think some of these areas we've learned in Canada require some very definitive government policy direction and programs to help implement it. So for instance, I'll just, as one example, and then is the Ontario Green Energy Act that was, I believe, introduced in 2009. We went from having, like, I don't know, 3 wind turbines in the province to having, you know, I don't know, thousands within a decade. So clearly, maybe not thousands, but well, over 1,000 anyways. So clearly government policy was, at the time it changed. Not everybody agreed with the particular policy direction, but if you're looking to introduce in more renewables into the economy, clearly government policy and implementation does matter. And so we're going to have to think a little bit about that, I think, both at a national and provincial level in Canada, because often the real work on some of these things gets done at a provincial level. And I use the Green Energy Act as one good example of that. There's a question here about whether we can speak to, and I'll just bring it up now, introduce it for a second, whether we can speak to urban design, and that is active transport less reliance on cars, etc. And I know that Britain has done this at least to some degree. And I know in Canada it's happened, and it's happening more. Depends really on where you are, I would say. I mean, the LEED certification for buildings and the introduction of efficiencies, green roofs, various things. These are things that have largely been driven not by government policy, as say wind development has been, but rather by, I think, the private sector taking it and trying to make it real. Government does tag along a little bit because government has significant ownership of buildings in various parts of Canada. Government's a big part of our economy, but really, I think this has been driven more by, more local initiatives. You see it to some degree, different cities and municipalities have sought to introduce these sorts of things. And so there is, I think, growth here. And I think one of the things that I'm seeing coming out of COP26, and also just generally, is that carbon and greenhouse gases, this has been big and small as an issue throughout my career, which is longer than I like to admit. It seems to be cool for 1 minute or 1 year, and then it kind of goes away and comes back. And it's a big deal right now. Well, it's also a big deal. Look at the markets, they're going up. So people can afford to think a little bit about greenhouse gas reductions. When the economy goes in the tank, then everybody stops thinking about that for a little while and thinks about jobs. But it seems to me that some of these things are becoming more baked into our economy in a variety of different ways, whether it's, government policy on renewables, whether it's, things like municipalities trying to reduce their carbon footprints, businesses and organizations like the one that Mark Carney marshaled at COP26, trying to make initiatives that stick and reduce, move companies towards net zero emissions. You take all of these things together, and I think things feel stickier right now. Actually, it's a question, maybe I'll pose it to Ben and to Jen, is whether that stickiness, whether you see the same stickiness I'm starting to see. I have no doubt that in the 2 or 3 years, in the next 2 or 3 or 5 years, at some point, the economy will go badly or relatively badly, and this won't be quite as cool. I was never a cool kid in school, so I'm used to that, being attached to these subject matters that kind of go like that. And I'm very comfortable when it's not cool. But it seems to me anyways that the breadth of the attention being paid to this from private sector and public sector around the world in different ways has to at least be leading us towards some improvement. Whether it's enough to get us to 1.5 or limit us to 1.5, I don't know. But I don't know, Ben, do you think it's maybe feeling stickier this time?
Yeah, I think so. And I think you're right about cycles of green being cool. I qualified as a lawyer in London in 2003, and I remember working on a very big development, and maybe this picks up some of the stuff about smart cities. And it was actually the Greenwich Peninsula. So if ever you've been to London and you've been to the Dome and watched a concert, that used to be just the most horrendously polluted site in London. It was a gasworks, all that kind of stuff. They got consent for 10,000 homes. It's going to be schools, all sorts of cool stuff. And there was talk about having green leases. So leases which would, require tenants to have their waste management in certain ways, not just putting light bulbs in, but tenant, a really strong tenant commitments about public transport, all this kind of stuff. But then there was a bit of a crash in the market generally, and people thought, oh look, tenants aren't going to pay for this stuff; it's too expensive. And actually, this afternoon I've been at a meeting with a large institutional developer who's sort of saying, right, no, we should be thinking about this stuff anymore. And yeah, it is going to be expensive, but we've got the clout to do it. And if any tenants quibble and say they don't want to sign up to green lease terms, we'll just go on their website, download the CEO's report of this retail or whatever, and say, right, you've got ESG standards, you promised to be green. So I think there is a feeling that it's going to stick. I hope it does. It's an interesting question around smart cities and what have you, because if you look at the Glasgow Pact, there's no mention of walking or cycling in this. EVs, yeah. Green corridors for shipping, yeah. How aviation may play its part, but nothing about maybe we could redesign our cities so that you could walk to places. We could put pavements in, and London is. I'm biased, so I'm going to say we're quite progressive. We have a pretty cool mayor in Sadiq Khan, and his London planning policies are pretty forward thinking in terms of requiring sustainable transport, green buildings, net zero buildings, all this kind of stuff. But on a wider environmental perspective, there isn't enough about parklets and these mini urban parks. And we've been doing some work with some charities in the UK about who plant sort of these mini forests, 600 trees in a really densely packed area to create biodiversity and what have you. There's a real issue in London at the minute about sort of air quality in poorer parts of in poorer parts of cities and what have you. For the first time ever recently, a young girl who died of asthma, on her death certificate, it was poor air quality was put down on the death certificate. So I think urban design is a very, very significant issue, but I think it's getting traction. I really hope so.
Yeah, and to add to this, so I think Sharon asked this question about urban design, and I think that I like to talk a lot about division of powers, but the municipalities, although not recognized in our constitution, is a third level of government, and so they're doing. You talk about it being baked in, Adam. I think it's going to stick for a number of different reasons. So the Planning Act, which kind of governs decisions at the municipal level in Ontario, has included in Section 2, it requires municipalities, boards, and the tribunal that governs these decisions of municipalities to consider when they're thinking about the public interest, the mitigation of greenhouse gases and adaptation to a changing climate. And what we're seeing as different municipalities update their official plans, municipalities across Canada have declared climate emergencies. We see them, they all have to then follow the provincial statement in Ontario and pass official plans. And we're seeing that being baked into the official plans and the way that they make decisions. And what we're seeing in cases before tribunals, we're seeing arguments about climate change and adaptation and mitigation being made either in support of development or concerns about development. And we're seeing that not just in Ontario, but right across the country. So Greater Vancouver also has a specific plan with respect to climate change mitigation, in addition to their other plans. So I think that doesn't exactly answer the question, but I think because it's so diverse, Sharon, like right across Ontario and across Canada, the way that municipalities govern these things. So we're seeing this, we're seeing it in the governing legislation, we're seeing it in official plans. And I know that Ottawa City Council just passed an official plan that has a whole chapter on climate change.
Thanks, Tom. I thought you had something you wanted to address.
Oh, so yeah, we have another interesting question. Just before we leave the topic of municipalities and businesses too, I would say that at the municipal level, and of course, municipalities are quite important in Canada as they are in the UK. This has become an organizing principle of governance. So just to go back to that excellent question, it's perhaps a little bit beyond the topic of energy, but that question was from Sharon Mendere about organizing municipalities, urban design, urban transportation, sustainable transportation, active transportation, rail, light rail, all of those things. There's a lot of good things happening for some of us for the first time in our lives, really, in Toronto, in terms of the build out. And that, of course, is the build out of rail and public transportation. These projects are gigantic. They haven't been done for 2 generations, and they really do involve cooperation by all levels of government. And they will have a very positive impact on climate and on carbon emissions. So things are happening. I think a lot more will need to be done. Other questions are really interesting. A question from someone, and Ben, you kind of touched on it, but how do I encourage? I just think it's an important question. How do I encourage my employer to do their part? I think that's an interesting question. Not technically a legal question, but I'm sure we all have opinions. Maybe I'll start with you, Adam.
Well, I mean, my first response to that would be start with a conversation. I think the trick for most employers is going to be, what do they do? If they open the door, does it let the floodgates go and their employees are running in the streets and up in arms wanting their workplace to be completely different? And how is that going to affect my business? So, I mean, I think my first piece of advice is be constructive, come with ideas and not complaints, and see what you can make work is probably the way I would do it. Of course, it depends on your employer. If you're employed by, the government of Canada, you're going to have a little different time. If you're employed by one of Mark Carney's 450 companies, you might have some in his arrangement through the Financial Alliance to Net Zero. You might have a lot easier time. You'll also have a lot easier time if you happen to be the CEO or the CFO of one of those companies than you might be if you're further down the line. But a good idea is always a good place to start, I think.
Right, and I think to add to Adam's comments, I think it does depend on who your employer is. But I think that, we talk about these risks. There's a couple of other things that you can use in the arguments. It's, I think that on the other side of all the risks that we're talking about, there's also opportunities. And so a way to encourage your employer to make these changes and take these steps is to talk about, we're talking about all this money that's in reducing emissions in the world. We've got an opportunity right here. And your employer has an opportunity to take advantage of this and be ahead of the curve, because what we know is that these requirements are not going to lessen. I mean, this is the whole point of these COP meetings, is to pressure and encourage participants to continue upping their commitments over time. And it's better to start now than to wait until it's required. For example, the Canadian securities regulators have out for consultation right now reporting requirements related to climate change. And there's a question as to whether or not they're going to be mandatory or not. But again, this is the kind of information that if you kind of marshal this information for your employer, this is depending on who your employer is, it can be really motivating. Why wait for it to be imposed and required? Be ahead of the curve. And then finally, I'd say that there's a number of really great resources in Canada, depending on who your employer is, for boards to think about climate and climate risk, and how you can address it as a company. And you could encourage your employer, for example, to look at CCLI, which is the Canadian Climate Law Initiative. Some of us in our group are experts, and we go speak to boards about what they can do to think about not just address the risks and the requirements, think about what's coming down the road and with respect to the requirements of litigation, but also how to take advantage of the opportunities.
Tom, if it's okay, I just wanted to chat a little bit for a minute, turn the conversation a bit to Ontario. And I do this because I know we're getting close. We're not at the end of our time, but we don't have a ton of time left. And I think there's one topic that I wanted to just address that shows up in COP26. It also shows up in the front page of the newspapers and websites today in Ontario, and that's cars. And the reason I bring it up is because first of all, there's a zero emission vehicle group at COP26. I believe it was 10 automakers that committed to 100% of their fleets being made that be zero emission vehicles by 2040. So, Ontario has a robust and healthy and active and vibrant auto sector that frankly creates a huge amount of economic activity for us, partly because we're sitting next to this huge economy that buys most, or the largest plurality, if not the majority, I think it's about 3/4 of the cars built here are sold in the US. So for Ontario and Ontarians, the auto sector is important, at least to some degree, a significant degree. So this commitment, what does it mean for the sector? Not all of the companies that build cars in Ontario are signed on to this commitment, but frankly, that all auto manufacturers are starting to look at or examine increasing their zero emission or reduced emission vehicle fleets. And so the question really becomes, is this an opportunity or a challenge or both from the point of view of the Ontario auto sector? And then on top of that, and the reason I wanted to make sure we brought it up is that on top of that, we layer the incredibly complicated interrelationship between the Americans and Canadians from a trade point of view, and the challenge that the White House is trying to address, both in funding and encouraging their economy to come back to life after COVID, but also, frankly, looking at electoral politics as well. And so we're seeing, the introduction, from what I understand, of about a $12,500 subsidy for certain electric vehicles made in the US with US built batteries. Well, what does that do for Ontario? And it's going to make, I think, at the very least, it's going to be a real challenge, I would suggest, because The Ontario marketplace is not nearly as big as the US marketplace. The Canadian marketplace isn't as big, like less than a tenth the size of the American economy. And so if we're not able to sell there, that's gonna be a real challenge. So I think as Canadians and Ontarians, we should be hopeful that our politicians who are currently in Washington talking about these very things are successful in those conversations, because they're going to be critical to keeping our auto sector alive. And so we may have these international obligations or commitments that are being made federally by our federal government. But if they can't be backed up with a healthy, vibrant auto sector in Ontario, it's going to be a challenge. This is just one example, of course. There's many others, other parts of the economy. It's not just about the auto sector. But I think what this reminds me of, when you look back to the comments about the breadth of the initiatives that we're seeing coming out of COP, whether it's all the nations acting together or just groups of nations or groups of the economy or different people in different sectors, they're all going to play a part in seeing this change. And so, if we're going to be able to be more optimistic than sometimes we feel, and Ben has articulated some of the concerns about how we're going to get to where we need to be, it's going to take everybody rowing in the same direction in all different ways. So I would just say that I think that I wanted to bring up the auto sector and just put it out there as one area in particular that we have to watch for and look for how we can make it into an opportunity and not make it a challenge.
Well, interestingly, Adam, that is one area where the current Ontario government has some enthusiasm. Although the current government might not be as enthusiastic about renewable energy development as, say, for instance, previous governments were, I hope I put that politically correctly, but they certainly are enthusiastic about EVs and the development of EVs, and what an incredible opportunity that is. There was a really great piece in The Economist just before COP talking about the concrete and cement industry, and if put together I think their view was that if aggregated, the concrete industry worldwide would be the world's third largest emitter after China and the United States. And then, of course, aviation fuels. And there's lots, and Ben, you might have some views on this from the UK side, but I mean, there's a lot of innovation happening in Ontario on concrete and trying to create carbon negative concrete, which is, it's absolutely incredible. And the same with aviation fuels. And I know there's a lot of great things happening in Ontario, also in Quebec, in the Montreal technological ecosystem as well on aviation fuels. Ben, I don't know if you have any thoughts on those kind of industry plays that are coming down the pike.
Yeah, and I think actually the UK issued its net zero strategy about a week or two before COP26, which some may say was very convenient and possibly even a sort of a press opportunity. But in there, I mean, it was like an offering circular or an information memorandum, for overseas companies to come and invest in the UK. And there, the government is giving all sorts of seed funding essentially to universities and entrepreneurs and innovators, and saying, look, here's a few £1 million, go and see what you can do. And as you say, concrete absorbing CO2 is one of them, and a really interesting one was seaweed farming. The amount of carbon that is absorbed in the ocean through plankton and seaweed and what have you, it's bonkers. The carbon sequestration in the ocean is insane. So yeah, hopefully we'll start seeing seaweed farms just off the British coast soon. So yeah, a lot of stuff you just would have think, if you'd read about 5-10 years ago, you just think someone's been at the beer. But yeah, it's coming.
All right, I want to wrap up with a final question to each of you. So back in, I believe it was the summer of 2016, Mark Carney, who has gotten a lot of press here today, another great Canadian, just like Elon Musk, by the way, Ben, another great Canadian. Mark Carney was interviewed, and it was July of 2016 by the Toronto Board of Trade, and it was the first time I'd heard him make reference to this term, a Minsky moment. The idea that a sudden unforeseen market change has occurred. Was COP26 a Minsky moment? Has the world changed as a result of COP26? What's your takeaway? Jen, I'm going to start with you. Any views?
Well, I maybe this is a cop out, but I think from Canada's perspective, I think we need to wait and see. I don't think that I didn't see any commitment that was really significantly different than what Canada had already committed to. And again, we haven't seen their plan, other than perhaps the commitment that I don't know if we talked about this much, but to end the public financing of fossil fuel projects. But again, that had to do with international projects, and it wasn't about Canada's public financing of its own projects. So I think we don't know yet, but I do think it's kind of a building on. So it's continuing some momentum. It's continuing the conversation. We're talking about it right now, and hopefully it'll help continue to push actual meaningful.
Great. Adam, over to you. Ben, I'm going to give you the last word. Adam, any thoughts?
Yeah, no, I don't think it was a Minsky moment. I think, though, it was a signpost along the way, or a snapshot in time, and an opportunity for attention to be paid by the mainstream media to broaden the exposure to a lot of these interesting ideas and to make people more aware of them. So I don't think it changed anything. Now, maybe I'll be proven wrong in a few years, but I do think that it allowed an opportunity to stop along the way and say, hey, this is some stuff, some of it works, some of it's not bad, some of it's not as good as we'd like, but it's all part of where we need to go. And I think it'll be remembered. It was one of the major, I mean, the last May, they call, every so often we have a major COP, and Paris was a major COP, this was a major COP. And so expectations are raised very, very high for these meetings. I think in this case, we probably didn't reach those or achieve those expectations, but we moved the needle along a little bit, and it continues to move. So that's what I would say.
Thanks, Adam. Ben, over to you. Minsky moment or not?
Well, I'm still Googling what a Minsky moment is. I think something's been lost in translation here, Tom. But was it? Yeah, look, I'm going to say
big deal.
I'm going to say yes, it was a big deal, partly just to be contrary. But you know, I think it was. I think it showed that people, you know, that it's the Greta Thunberg effect. You know, 16-year-old goes on a climate strike, and to our anonymous question about, you know, how you do that, you know, start a campaign. Look what it did for Greta. No, I think. I think it's clear that this is an issue close to millennials' hearts. Our generation have messed up the planet, but I think the next one was really going to sort it out. I think there's been some really good stuff coming out since COP. You know, the UK and the EU have proposed legislation on forest risk commodities, saying companies have got to do due diligence if they're using beef, leather, cocoa, palm oil, timber, rubber, all that kind of stuff. I think, you know, there is momentum. As I say, I just have a slight anxiety as to whether that momentum will continue in the next year or two at future COPs, but I think it was a good thing, and I hope that continues.
Excellent. Well, with that, I want to thank each of our panelists, Adam Chamberlain, Jennifer King, Ben Stansfield. Thank you all very much. I also want to thank each of you in the audience. Your questions were amazing. And we see that most people, almost everyone who signed in, stayed on. So hopefully the hour was good. And we look forward to seeing everyone again, hopefully live and in person at our roundtables. They're held in September, October, and November each year. They're focused on energy and energy innovation, and we're always looking for topics, we're always looking for speakers, we're always looking for ideas, and once again, this session was recorded. It will be available online on our website. If you have any questions or any ideas, feel free to reach out to me or to any of our speakers. And once again, everyone, thank you very much and enjoy the rest of the day. Take care.